Good evening. Welcome to the Center for Global Humanities. It's an interesting place now. I just got back from Morocco. We just built a wonderful lecture hall, and our speaker tonight is just flew from Scotland. So it's becoming a truly international and global place. Greg Woolf, who will be talking to us tonight, he has degrees from Oxford and Cambridge and had fellowships at both universities before moving to Scotland in 1998. He has had visiting positions in Brazil, France, Germany, and Italy, and has lectured very widely. His research concerns the cultural history of antiquity, viewed in the broadest sense. He has co-edited volumes on literacy, on Rome as a cosmopolis, on ancient libraries and encyclopedias, on gender in the ancient city, and published on Roman archaeology and the economy. He is the author of Becoming Roman, The Origins of Provincial Civilization in Gaul, Es-tu brute, or Tu brute, A Short History of Political Murder, Harvard and London, 2007, and Tales of the Barbarians, published in 2000. The previous book was published in 2007, and Tales of the Barbarians was published in 2011. He's currently researching the process through which the first religions emerged between classical antiquity and the Middle Ages. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Greg Woolf.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for the invitation to come here. I feel very much at home already. I live in a small fishing village on the east neuk of Fife in Scotland, where they try and pull up as many lobsters and crabs as you guys do. And as it happens, my wife was brought up in a small town in Devon called Bideford. So you see, I feel I'm among family already. It's a great pleasure to come and talk to you about the Romans. I haven't got bored with them yet, and all those many years, as Anouar said, I've been working on them. And what I want to do now is to take you on a little tour of the Roman Empire and talk particularly about one big question, and here's the big question. And it's a question that we face today in all our societies, and it's this: how do we live together, given we're so different? This is also a question, of course, that lots of married couples ask each other, but it applies just as much to civil society. How is it that we create a harmonious civil society when we're so divided? And it's not a new challenge. And I was thinking in the months preparing for this, because Anouar is very organised and invited me quite a long time ago. I was thinking, what's the way to get into this? And of course, in the end, the answer was given me by the BBC News, by all the news stations. And you've got it here. Two different kinds of public space: the Roman Forum and Independence Square in Kiev just a few days ago. What have they got in common? Columns, I suppose, crowds of people and ruins. But they have very different stories behind them. And what I wanted to do was to ask a little bit why scenes like the one we see on the right and the tragedy, the drama that's unfolding at the moment, are oddly not characteristic of the Roman world. Why is it that the Roman world does seem to avoid these terrible conflicts, regional conflicts, sectarian conflicts, persecution of minorities? Did they have a secret? And I'm going to say, I suppose, towards the end that I think I understand why it didn't happen that way then, but we can't do what they did. But I hope the route we get there will be interesting. So talking a little bit about the Ukraine and why things have gone the way they have. For those who don't know it, this is the Ukraine here. And we can ask, why have things gotten the way they have in the Ukraine? We can talk about in terms of geopolitics, a huge country, the second largest in Europe, sitting next to the European Union in the light blue and the Russian Federation, or Russia, here. Around it, Belarus, other states that want to join the European Union. So we can think about it in terms of geopolitics, caught in the middle, or we can think about it in terms of its pretty horrendous history over the 20th century. I just gave you the last 100 years. A state that briefly became free of the Russian at the end of the Tsarist regime, but almost immediately reconquered into the USSR. that's then made up with a patchwork of states conquered from other countries at a time where Russia and Nazi Germany are in alliance. A state which then becomes independent briefly on the collapse of the USSR, but never really gets complete freedom, and then the series of economic and political crises that have led up to the ones today. But we know, don't we, that there's more to it than that. And underneath this story, there's something else. And that something else is about the diversity of people in the Ukraine, about how they're internally divided. I take some facts from the CIA World Fact Book. What language do they speak? 2/3 of them speak Ukrainian, and 1/4 of them speak Russian. And then there's all these other groups. That can't help, can it? Particularly when the Russians live to the eastern edge of the country. What about religions? Well, we might think they're mostly Orthodox, but 50% follow the Kiev Patriciate, that's the Ukrainian Patriciate, and then you have 1/4 following the Moscow one. And then you have all these other groups together, most of them religious affiliations, which we don't have over here, but some Protestants, some Jews, some others. And if you look at the ethnic groups, you see again a country bitterly divided. 4 out of 5 of them consider themselves Ukrainian, not quite a fifth Russian, and then all these other tiny minorities as well. Belarusians, Moldovians, Crimean Tatars, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Romanians, and the rest. And this is a story that's been played out over Europe for 100 years, hasn't it? States which contain in them tiny minorities or big minorities. And how does it play out into the current crisis? That these people don't all live together, that there are regional power bases for the different politicians, that those who speak Russian feel more sympathy towards the Russians, others towards the Europeans. Even worse, that in many areas you have people mixed up, cities where people live together, but don't live together in harmony. And that's the key question. Why not in harmony? A house divided but also indivisible. You can't sort this out the way we tried to sort things out in the 20th century by cutting nations in half, by slicing them, having north and a south area or west and an east area, or taking one bit off and putting it with another country. All those experiments were tried in the 20th century to try and neaten the map, and it doesn't work. In other words, it's a political condition of all modern nations that, in a sense, I want to persuade you, we are all Ukrainians, we all live in countries like this, that are divided among ourselves, that have minorities in them, that we're never ever going to manage to jiggle the boundaries just right in the way that, say, the Greeks and the Turks exchanging populations did. This is, if you like, the tragedy or the challenge of modern political states. And what I'm interested in is why it's not the tragedy of ancient states. Because world emperors like Alexander the Great and the Emperor Augustus also ruled over huge polyglot empires. They also had hundreds of thousands of people in them, millions in the case of the Roman emperors. This one is Augustus here. You'll notice that despite his gorgeous Greek hero's body, he's waving a palm of victory. You have Kaiser Divi F. This means Caesar, the son of a god. And he's got his foot on not in fact a football, not even a soccer ball, but this is a foot on the world. So this is a world emperor, Augustus, and the other world emperor, the world conqueror, Alexander the Great. Forever beautiful, gorgeous, young. Julius Caesar is said to have burst into tears when he stood before a statue of Alexander the Great, because Alexander had died having conquered the world at a younger age than Caesar was when he felt he'd done nothing. And we all know a little bit how that feels. So how is it that world empires in the past don't end up torn apart the way that the Ukraine is, the way that every country in Europe, the way that countries around the world are torn up by ethnic, religious, other differences? What is it that the ancients knew that we've forgotten, or what is it that they did that we're not doing? That's my question. Now, there's actually quite a lot of world empires, if you think about 200 CE. I'm using CE rather than AD. AD and old money, if you like. But if you look around the world, or look around the eastern bit of the world, around 200, and you've got a series of empires. The Roman one here, around the Mediterranean Sea, but also its great continental hinterland, not quite as far as the Baltic, not quite as far as where I live in Fife. They got pretty close. And out into Syria. And then you have a Persian Empire here, the Parthians. And then you have the Kushan around Afghanistan and eastern Iran, and then smaller states in India, and then the great Chinese Han Dynasty, the Romans opposite. And if you can think about it, about a fifth of the world's population live in the Roman Empire, and a fifth are ruled by the Chinese emperor, and the other lot get divided. If you moved the date here 200 or 300 years forward or back at any one time, you'd see some changes. You might see the Persian Empire sometimes gets as far as up here and out to here. Alexander the Great briefly from here down to there. Sometimes the Chinese Empire gets further into the steppe than others. But by and large, you're seeing a string of empires that move across, and all of them, naturally, have vast populations within them that are not people who are alike to each other. So if we can generalize a little bit about these early empires, all of these pre-industrial empires, and it would apply as well to the ones in the Western Hemisphere, to the Inca, to the Aztec, all of them rule culturally diverse populations. All of them have to cope with linguistic differences and with a wide range of religious beliefs, with dozens and dozens and hundreds and thousands of gods clustering together. All of them we can divide up, if we want, into great regions. The tropical south of China as against the steppe. Or you can think about dividing Persia, with its western end touching the Mediterranean and the high plateau of Iran. So none of these areas are homogeneous. They all of them end up creating huge polyglot cities: Rome, Babylon, Cuzco. Cities which are sustained by huge flows of taxes from all ends of the earth. Great roads, canals draw the population towards them. The population are brought in as slaves or as servants or as representatives or as levy labour, and they're all mixed up, and none of them understand exactly what each other are like. All these early empires are in this way exactly the same. And they're also exactly the same in that they're not torn or apart the way that the Ukraine is today. So in what I can call the condition of pre-modernity, a world before ours, all the things we think make this better are not there. When we look at the Ukraine or we look at other places, we say, well, not enough democracy. But none of these empires were democracies. It would have been impossible anyway to create a democracy with several million people in empires that took 40 days to cross, 60 days in the case of the Roman ones. There was, of course, a legacy of democracy in the Roman world, but the word democratia under Rome doesn't mean democracy anymore. It means something like a republic. It means a well-ordered government. The ideals of Athens, of all those Greek city-states, have long gone, because you can't run a democratic system in an early world, without an early empire, when people can't communicate with each other. And they don't have a principle of equal rights. They actually, when we have ancient writers writing about civil rights or human, they're appalled at the idea that everyone should be treated as equal, because transparently they're not. Why would you possibly give a vote to everybody, irrespective of whether they're educated or whether they're good? If we believe that in our own communities, we listen to people we trust, we think are good, or experts, why on earth should we give them no more say than people who are not good and not experts? Aristotle regards pure democracy as a mad form of government. And you can kind of see the argument. As for human rights, most of them have an idea of a human, sort of. Not necessarily the same as our idea, but they certainly don't believe all humans are alike. They believe some humans are born in such a way that they're most likely to be wild, Scythians on the steppe, or decadent, people living in the great cities of Asia Minor or Athens. These populations then are not alike, and so there's no notion of equal rights, no notion of civil or human rights, nothing that we could compare to the UN Charter. So this is another thing that we say is missing when we look at states tearing apart. We say they don't respect civil rights, but this wasn't the ancient answer. None of them thought that cultural diversity was a good thing. It's impossible to find a Latin phrase meaning multi-faith dialogue. The Greek for multiculturalism doesn't exist. The Greeks didn't have a word for it. And so from this point of view, most of our modern solutions, if they're solutions, weren't tried in the ancient world, and so they neither failed nor worked. How did they then evade what seemed to us to be problems posed by diversity? I'm going to talk a bit about the Romans now, because that's one of the things I like to do and because that's what you expect me to do. And I'll talk a little bit about the Roman Empire in terms which some of you, I hope, won't find too basic, but it's a good idea for you at least to see what I think the basics are. And so here you have a map of the Roman Empire, and it's the green bits are the bits that are ruled at the point where Rome moves from being a republican form of government to a monarchy. AD 14, the death of the first emperor Augustus, who'd more or less come to power in 31 BC. So after 45 years in power, he leaves an empire that looks like this. If I had a more complicated map, which would be a dreadful thing to look at, I would also be able to show you how much of the empire was not there in 60 BC, when the first of the great republican generals, Pompey, starts to conquer. And if that, then follow my cursor, you can see the bits that are north of it. You wouldn't have anything north of there. You wouldn't have most of Spain. You certainly would only have odd patches of Africa. Pompey did manage to do stuff in Syria and Palestine, but none of the, all around here, all that inland area would not be there. Most of the Roman Empire is conquered by the generals who fight battles in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s BCE. And it's consolidated by Augustus. And then the purple bits of later additions, some of which stuck and some which didn't. Here's Britain, there's Hadrian's Wall. Well, they did occasionally get further north, and actually it wasn't quite true, they never got north where I live. This is where I lived there, just on the end of that little spot. The east nook of Fife, nook is Scots, broad Scots for nook, as in nook and cranny, corner, this tiny corner. And there is a small line of signal forts just to the north of there, just to the north of Dundee, the Gask Ridge, and that's the furthest north they ever got. But mostly the green bits where they stuck. What's the Roman Empire like? It has about 60 million people in it. Some people think about 100 million people. I think 60. It's very difficult to know for sure. It's about 20% of the planet's population. Because it doesn't occupy 20% of the planet's surface, it occupies some of the most densely populated bits of it. We think of Rome as a city, as an urban culture, and it is, in the sense that that's where the books are written, that's where the rich people did their stuff, that's where politics happened. But in this empire of 60 million people, there are perhaps only 1,000 cities. And by city, I mean something over 5,000. I don't think we'd call it a city now if only 5,000 people, would we? They did, however, have about 10 cities with more than 100,000, and the biggest, Rome, has about 1 million people. And so the total urban population of the empire is maybe 10 million people. These are very approximate figures. But it gives you an idea, and the idea I want to give you is this. They were thinking about a world which had a very small number of very large cities and a very large number of very small ones. And if you think, do we know places like that today? The answer is yes. The developing world. If you go south of the Sahara, much of Africa, you'll find tiny, tiny settlements and then occasionally one or two enormous ones. So the Roman Empire has the same shape demographically, sociologically, as a developing nation, except it's not experiencing rapid population growth. So it's a kind of developing nation that isn't developing, which is maybe not a good place to be. It's kind of stuck in a world of staggering inequality, of the biggest city in the world as 1 million people, but most cities are in the tens of thousands. So it's a word, it would almost be true to say it's a word of villages with a small number of cities, wouldn't it? It's also a world where most people don't live in the cities. Most people live in the countryside, in villages or in scattered farms. And it's a world where most of them could read almost nothing. So this is the kind of sociology you need to think of. If you want to think of what it looks like, well, I've given you the map already, but I wanted to point out that the Roman Empire, of course, is it's got a very corrugated landscape and it has rich river valleys. So if you think, where do people live? They live where the river valleys are. They live in the coastal strips, the dark green bits here, and Carthage. Some of the densest populated, most of the most densest populated areas are the Nile Valley, the great river valleys that flow east to west, off the Anatolian plateau, so what's now Western Turkey, cities like Ephesus, Smyrna, cities like Pergamon, Nicomedia, Nicaea. Here's Athens. They live in central Italy, around the capital, around the city of Rome. And then there are other places they live, but between them there are great areas which are, by modern standards, almost empty. The mountainous ridge, the Abruzzi, the Apennines of Italy, the interior of the Balkans, mountain valleys, the high plateau of Anatolia. Not completely empty, but this population of 60 million people is crunched up. It's crunched up into valleys with cities in them, between which there's landscapes that are thinly or sparsely populated. How do they communicate? There are three big languages in common. Two of them they admit to, one they don't. The two they admit to are Latin and Greek. Greek, the language of the Greeks, the language the Macedonian conquerors, led by Alexander the Great, took east with them. It's the most common language spoken from Mesopotamia, that's modern Iraq, Iran, Syria, Asia Minor, modern Turkey, the Aegean world, Egypt, eastern parts of Libya, the islands, the Black Sea, all these areas. The most common language to speak is Greek, and that's the language that gets inscriptions are most commonly put up in, the language people write literatures in. And there's also Greeks in Sicily and in southern Italy and in the south of France. In fact, they're almost everywhere. Greek was the big original common language of the Mediterranean. Then on top of that, overlaid on top of that, is Latin, the language of the Roman conquerors, the language of the army, wherever it is. People write in Latin in Egypt, on the frontier with Persia, as well as the language of the Western provinces, France, Gaul, Germany, Africa. And then there's also this one they don't admit, Aramaic, a language which was the imperial language of the Persian Empire when it stretched up to the Mediterranean. This is the language of Christ. This is the language which people probably speak below the level of the elite in most of these countries. And it fragmented into its various dialects. But these are just the big languages. Most people live in communities where lots of people speak different and write different languages. Communities like Tangier. Or Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls are written in Greek, in Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic, perhaps in Nabatean. There's a copy of the Samaritan Old Testament which is written in Hebrew but in a different script. I edited a book on libraries that Anouar mentioned, and we had a wonderful talk from Kim Ryholt at the University of Copenhagen. He described the contents of an Egyptian priestly library in Egypt in the 3rd century CE, the library at Tebtunis, the library of Sobek, the crocodile god. And here you have text written in Egyptian Demotic and in the priestly script hieratic, and then great scrolls with the Book of the Dead in hieroglyphs, just so you know what to do with the dead. And then they also have Greek texts, Greek myths about Egypt, and they don't keep them in the temple, but they keep them back home. They have copies of Homer, and they have copies of Greek tragedy, because these guys could speak Greek and do the Greek thing when they weren't feeling like Egyptian priests. And this is the norm in the ancient world. It's a world which is normally half competent in a dozen languages. It's a world in which people are striving to gain that high level of expertise that allows them to give speeches in Greek and write elegant letters in Latin. Almost none of them are getting there, but they're all managing with all these different languages together. And in the background, inscriptions on stone, on rocks in the Syrian desert, on bits of pottery and so on. We find text in Syrian, Phoenician, Syriac, in Palmyran, in Sapphitic, in Hebrew, Nabatean, all the different Celtic and German languages and languages we're not sure what they are in the western provinces. The descendants of Phoenician settlers in Spain and Sardinia and Sicily, as well as in North Africa, speaking Punic. St. Augustine, the 4th century CE, still claimed he could hear people speaking the Canaanite language in the hinterland of Africa. This is a world in which people are speaking constantly to each other in languages that perhaps only a few people around them can understand. Asia Minor we know particularly well: Lycian, Lycaonian, Galatian, Celtic, Phrygian, Pisidian, Cappadocian, Carian are the best known, underneath Aramaic and underneath Greek. And the greatest Babels of all are the great cities of the empire: Rome, 1 million, a huge population of Greeks, huge population of Jews, and traders and slaves from all over the empire, because Rome gobbles people up. Ancient demography means that in these big cities, the death rate is always much greater than the birth rate, which means just to keep going, to keep staying at a population of 1 million, you're constantly having to top it up year by year. At least 10,000 slaves brought in every year to top up the population. Alexandria, a bit smaller, same effects though. Greeks, Macedonians, Egyptians, Jews, they're the most common, but you find Persians. The longest Etruscan text comes from Alexandria. Antioch, Carthage, Athens, Ephesus. It is no coincidence these are also the cities in which the great world religions were invented. Antioch is the first place people were called Christians. And connecting them up, globalizing forces. Not as powerful as the globalizing forces today, but all the same, you throw out an empire, you reduce national boundaries, you create a common currency, common languages, some measure of security, trade increases, populations move, and you get some of the same effects. Populations moving backwards and forwards, and I've listed on the slide some of the most prominent ones. Jews, Syrians, Italians, Greeks trading, military colonists scattered out into the northern provinces, and then slaves drawn in from the edge of the empire, unskilled slaves from the northern provinces, skilled slaves from Greece, Syrians, Greeks, all the rest of them brought in. And so a mixed up world. So this should be a world that should tear itself apart, shouldn't it? This should be a world in which diversity and minority cultures should be pulling at the fabric of the civil order all the time. But it isn't. A world full of gods. Here's Jupiter. This is a statue of Jupiter in the Hermitage. He's the chief god of the Romans. The Romans had their own collection of gods, a pantheon of gods. But so did the Etruscans, and so did the Greeks, and so did the Spaniards and the Gauls. All these different groups with their different religions, all slightly different. And when they travel abroad, these diasporic populations worship their new gods with them. How do they get on? Well, sometimes they live side by side. People went to one temple, passing the temple to the other gods next door. Sometimes they claimed that one god was the same as another. Sometimes they drew strange new gods were created. Serapis, created out of Osiris and Dionysius, joined together. You could worship as many gods as you liked or none. Nobody noticed, nobody counted, nobody cared. There was some broad sense of toleration. The Romans drew the line occasionally. They drew the line at magic. They drew the line at witchcraft. They drew the line at human sacrifice. Mostly probably not because they think it didn't work, because it worked too well and they were scared of its effects. The elder Pliny says one of the things you've really got to thank the Romans for is they exterminate magic. And he had this wonderful vision he describes of the Roman power spreading out until the only magic left is the Druids out in Britain and the Magi, like in the Bible, the Magi out in Persia. So magic is pushed to the edge of a rational, well-ordered Roman world. Of course it's not. They push cursed tablets into the graves of gladiators to get back on their enemies. Magic is very definitely part of the Roman world. And what does it look like in space? It looks like temples sitting next to each other. So this is a schematic map of the city of Pompeii. This is the Forum area, which is where a lot of the Roman-style temples cluster. The Temple of Jupiter, you've got a picture of that on the right. The Temple of the God of the Emperor Vespasian. Sanctuaries to the household gods of the Roman people. A temple to Augustan fortune, the good fortune of the Emperor Augustus, because you can worship these kind of personifications too. A temple of Apollo, but also notice, alongside this, Asclepius, the Greek healing god, Isis, the great Egyptian goddess, a temple of Venus that goes back long before the Romans ruled Pompeii to when it was a city run by a people called the Oscans, who called her something else. Here's Isis again, her temple in Pompeii. From the outside, an ordinary street block, but inside has a slightly strange, slightly Egyptianizing design. And here's a nice picture from Herculaneum. The priests have shaven heads, they wear long robes, they carry Egyptian ritual implements. The water they claim is genuine Nile water. Very difficult to verify or falsify, obviously. Well, there are temples of Isis where crocodiles splish-splash around, and we're often a bit mean about this when we hear it described in literary text. And then a few years ago, people found in northern France a couple of ivory tablets in a sanctuary in the Ardennes, on which were inscribed magic writing and astrologies in actual Egyptian hieroglyphs. So, there are people reading or writing or possessing or pretending to read Egyptian hieroglyphs in Belgium, more or less. So this gives some idea about how scrambled the empire can be. Let's look at conflict, because there were some conflicts, but very few. We get a series of provincial revolts in one part or another of the Roman Empire, mostly in the first century of conquest. I've given you Boudica here, riding her chariot along the embankment of the Thames. Actually, Boudica's relationship with London was a bit less friendly in those days, but she's commemorated as a great British hero. Boudica went through quite a vogue in Britain during the reign of Queen Victoria for obvious reasons, and so we do get statues of her dotted around the country. And I actually had a graduate student came from Brazil to study Victorian British attitudes to Boudica, and she travelled around all these provincial British museums finding statues and paintings. And the same thing happens all over Europe. If you go to the Netherlands, you keep finding beautiful paintings of the revolt of Kivilis, the Batavian leader here. But he's dressed up in the costume of the Dutch revolt against the Spanish. And so he becomes a kind of proto-nationalist, a proto-rebel. And you get this, and there are plays, and there's all sorts of things. And there's not long after Tacitus' works were found in a German monastery in the 15th century, one of Martin Luther's friends, Ulrich von Hutten, wrote a bogus Tacitian account in which the great German general Arminius, who fought against Augustus's legions, goes to hell, and he has a debate with Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar about who's the best general. Guess who wins? Arminius does, Hermann the German. So there's a wonderful sort of story about the European reappropriation of these heroes. But they actually all appear in a rather brief period of Roman history, which is not immediately on conquest, but soon after. In other words, it seems to be a period of settling in. And then, in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, these provinces seem, for the most part, to be very peaceful. There are the wars in Judea. I will come back to them, but the first one certainly happening about the same time as these others, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt of the 130s. And where do these revolts occur? Well, unsurprisingly, you're more likely to revolt if you live near the front of the Roman Empire than if you live in the middle of it. Well, that's not rocket science, is it? You're also more likely to revolt if the Romans are attacking each other at the time. So civil wars tend to be an opportunity that people take, although often they take the opportunity to join one of the Roman sides against the others. And it happens early rather than late. So regional conflicts in the Roman Empire are something that happen, but not very many. Very early on, usually special circumstances, and then it all calms down. What about intercommunal violence? What about scenes like the scene we've been watching in Kiev? Well, there's almost none, which is bizarre. In Rome, there are a few incidents. Early in the Roman period, we find, usually at a time of some other political crisis, a bit of scapegoating. Worse was the Egyptian gods, Jews driven out of the city. They're back there in 10 years' time. There's no stories of pogroms, no mass killings. There are riots in Alexandria in the reign of Claudius between the Greek community and the Jewish community. And they don't seem to get on fantastically well for the rest of antiquity. But nothing like what the European Middle Ages have got to offer. There are rare religious tensions. But the death toll is minute. These big, diverse, polyglot cities seem somehow to rub along okay in a way that I find quite puzzling. So is the Roman world a world of peace? Well, Pax Romana It does mean peace, sort of, but pax is a kind of muscular peace. It means often a lot more like security. Pax is something you do to people. It's not something that emerges happily out of a good relationship. Roman peace is about order. It's about a bond. The Pax Deorum is the bond between humans and gods that ensures the earthly order. And if you start rummaging around for good quotes on peace from Roman literature, pretty soon you'll get the idea. They make a wilderness and they call it peace. Famous lines put into the mouths of a barbarian chieftain criticizing the Romans by the Roman Tacitus. If you want peace, prepare for war. Much repeated. Probably comes from Vegetius. And then the big one is from the Romans' mission statement, the epic poem written by Virgil for the first emperor Augustus, in the course of which the founder of the Roman people, Aeneas, goes to hell. He's taken on a tour of hell where people speak to him, including, he hears a great prophecy, and the prophecy from Jupiter tells him what the rest of Roman history is going to be like. Others, says Jupiter, will forge breathing bronzes more smoothly. At least I think so. They will draw forth living features from the marble. They will plead lawsuits better. They will trace the moon to the sky with a rod, describe the rising stars. These others are the Greeks. This is what Virgil is saying. The Greeks will be the great bronze workers. The Greeks will produce marble sculptors. Greeks will be orators. Greeks will be astronomers. You, Roman, govern the nations with your power, remember this. These will be your art, to impose the ways of peace. Show mercy to the conquered, subdue the proud. This is what peace means for the Romans. Peace is subduing the conquered, is showing mercy to the conquered, but subduing the proud. Debellere superbos. And here is Aeneas fleeing Troy on a couple of nice little images. This is the founder of the Roman state. Images of this myth, the myth which Virgil celebrates, pop up all over the Roman world. I've given you a couple of rather rare examples. A terracotta statue from Naples and a more recently discovered marble relief from the city of Aphrodisias. You can tell it's Aeneas because he's got his son in his hands. He's leading his toddler on and he's carrying his dad. And this is a key image for the Romans of continuity from one generation to another. Aeneas is pietas, he carries piety towards his father, his sense of posterity. This is the line that leads from Troy up there to Rome down there. Ascanius, Iulus, will be the founder of the Julii, the ancestor of Julius Caesar. This one also has a rather sad dimension to it, that when he's doing this, he happens to forget about his wife who gets burnt to death in the city. But, Rome wasn't built in a day. Nobody claimed that the Aeneid is an entirely happy story. And never mind because the gods have prepared an Italian princess for him waiting at the other end. So, naught for your comfort. I've sketched out for you something of what's happened in the Roman Empire in terms of conflict. So what I want to do now is to try and find some kind of answer to my question. And the answer, I think, is going to be about Roman ideas of civilization. And I've given you here a quotation from Pliny the Elder, the same man who talked about the expulsion of magic. And he's praising Italy. And the key phrase to look at is here. He's praising all the things that Italy does and pointing out that it's the God's will that it does this, that the Romans are fulfilling their destiny. And the destiny is to give civilization to mankind. And the words he uses, the Roman word for civilization, which is humanitas, to give humanity, if you like, to a human being, to humankind, to become the homeland of every people in the entire world. And this concept of humanity is, if you like, at the centre of the way Romans think about their culture. And this is, if you like, the centre of their values. For Romans, humanity, humanitas, is the opposite of barbarism. Barbarians are halfway to beasts. They behave often like beasts. They have the rationality of beasts. They have live bodies. They feel pain, all the rest of it. But they don't have the kind of intellects that civilized people have. They're fit to be tamed or treated as slaves or killed. But fortunately, it's not a terminal condition, because barbarians can be civilized, which is extremely good news if you're a barbarian. And actually, it's a step up from being a Greek barbarian, because the Greeks just divide the word into Greeks and barbarians, and it's really, really tough to get to be a Greek if you start out on the wrong side of that line. Now, we don't have a great Roman treatise on humanity, which is a shame, and we have to reconstruct what they thought from it from conversations overheard, odd comments in the course of other texts. Cicero, writing to his brother, who seems to be a relatively unsuccessful governor in Asia Minor, writes that Quintus owes it to his own humanity to rule over them well. And he says you owe it to them, particularly since you're ruling Greeks, who invented humanity, but even if you were ruling barbarians, even if you were ruling Africans or Gauls or savage peoples, you would still owe it to yourself, your own sense of who you are, to behave humanely. So this isn't a council of enlightened self-interest. This is about ethics and principles. Vitruvius, the great architect in Augustus' reign, writes that humanity is at the beginning of history. It's at what we would call the cusp between prehistory and history. As soon as you begin to get laws, governments, cities, civilized ways of life, people begin to have these values. And before that, they are living in the wild like animals, every hand raised against another. For some, civilization is something invented by the Greeks and then spread by the Romans. And they usually go on to say, and the Greeks aren't that great at it anymore. So there's a great arc. You start as a barbarian, you then become civilized, and then if you're a Greek, you end up going down into decadence on the other end. The Romans are constantly balanced at that point. No longer barbarians, not yet decadent. They're the moderating impulse. Just like Italy is the centre of the world, so the Romans are the centre point, the rational norm around which other people are under or overdeveloped in ethical terms. And of course, the Romans, some of them, like Tacitus, are perfectly capable of ironising and describing how once the Britons had accepted baths and had built temples and had learnt to speak and had learnt their Latin, that they weren't in fact civilized. They had mistaken slavery for humanity. They had thought they were being civilized. In fact, they're being reduced to a condition of servitude. Tacitus is always good at this sort of stuff. If we try and work out the content of humanity, we can do it by comparing it to Greek concepts, or we can do it comparing it to other Roman concepts. It's a bit like the Greek word for paideia, but that means something really literary culture. It's a bit like their idea of philanthropia, a great sense of moral obligation towards those who are less virtuous and less well developed than you are. And it's a bit like their notion of Hellenism. But whereas the Greeks keep Greekness for the Greeks, the Romans have universalized it. They've said civilization is available to anyone. Anybody can become civilized if they learn to behave in a particular way. And this is fundamentally vital. It's a huge weakness in Greek civilization that the empire set up by Alexander and the others can never quite forget the people they ruled were utterly unlike them, belonged to a lesser kind of humanity, are children, if you like, of a lesser god. Positively, the Romans connect Humanitas to treating the gods properly, to keeping your word, to even the Greeks know it. Polybius, a hostage in Rome, said, it's the extraordinary thing about the Romans, they actually keep their oaths. They keep their promises. It's bizarre. And occasionally you get an inscription out from the Far East saying, yeah, the Romans are the most religious of men. So it does seem to be something that at least the Romans talked about publicly, although, of course, no doubt they were no better than living up to their values than we sometimes are. Now, it'd be nice, I suppose, to imagine that this was a Roman set of ideas that propelled them outwards, so their uniquely civilized quality is what gained them the empire. So we could then feel that a nice story is being told where people have gone on and got what they deserved. But I don't think it was really like that. You'll notice the first of my speakers, the first witness to the ideas of humanity, is Cicero. And Cicero is living at the very last years of the Roman Republic, just before it all collapses. Did other people think about it in those terms? Well, we haven't got very much Latin from earlier centuries. But I suspect they didn't. I suspect that just like Romans invent words for empire, for province, for commander, and begin to think about obligations to provincials only when they've conquered the empire, only at the very last bit. In a fit of retrospective reflection, I suspect it's at that moment that people like Cicero, cobbling together and adjusting Greek ideas, begin to develop a sense of imperial obligation. That seems to be the case with most imperial nations. You don't find people who go out and led by an imperial vocation when they haven't got an empire and then get an empire. If you look at the language of imperialism in French or British 19th century empires, you'll find that mostly it comes at the end, not at the beginning of the great campaigns of conquest. Part of this ties up with the Roman sense of who they are. Romans, unlike Greeks, don't believe that they've always been the way they have. They believe their ancestors were barbarians. Or even they believe that their ancestors came from lots of different places. Some from Arcadia, some from Etruria, some from the Sabine area. As if Rome is a place assembled out of different bits and pieces. Maybe a polyglot city and a polyglot empire isn't so hard to live with if you don't think your ancestors had as much in common as you do. If you've got an ideology or a sense of yourself as a people who have come together in historical time, not who've been there since the beginning. Two powerful myths express this. One is the myth that Romulus, in order to fill his city with people, declared that he would accept anybody and made his city into an asylum into which robbers and exiles and vagabonds and thieves could all gather and have a fresh start. Unsurprisingly, there were more of these were male than female. And so you have a problem about continuity. How does the city of Rome carry on? And it carries on by kidnapping the women of the Sabines, the story of the Sabine women. And so these two very uncomfortable myths, a myth of a people descended from bandits on the one side and from kidnapped women on the other. And remember, the even more uncomfortable myth behind it all, that it had two brothers who founded it, one of whom killed the other. A city founded on fratricide. This is a people who have an uncomfortable past. Not, of course, that it really happened that way. We've no idea what really happened. What we can say, though, is that to Romans in the first centuries CE and the first centuries BCE, the most appropriate of all the myths they could find were stories about fratricide and rape and banditry and brigandage. When they looked at themselves, they thought, what are we like? Where do we come from? And they didn't say, we have been here since before the flood or anything. They said, yeah, we are the children of people who are worse than us. We're better than our parents. That's quite an interesting way to build a community, isn't it? They thought they had no gods of their own because they shared gods with many Italian peoples, and after a while they began to think the same, that Jupiter and Zeus were the same, that Mars and Ares were the same, that Venus and Aphrodite were the same. In other words, they felt they worshipped gods that were common gods. They didn't even have a language of their own because lots of cities spoke Latin and other Italian cities and peoples nearby spoke languages closely related. And so this is a people who don't have anything like that strong sense of common descent, common blood, common language, common culture, common gods that we often think of as the basis of a people today. And instead they have a place, Rome. They have a community, one they've made for themselves. They have laws invented in historical time and amended and lived by. And they have an unfolding history. And I expect you can see now what I've left unsaid, which is that a national story like this is a compelling model for people creating new nations in the last few hundred years. So instead of humanity, instead of a sense of humanitas, I think they have a set of core values beneath all this. Values like treating the gods with respect and treating humans with respect. A sense of social bonds that connect up a community in which the gods and other humans, their own family, their wider kin, their fellow citizens, are all bound to them, patrons to clients, masters to slaves. A sense, in other words, of a densely woven society and woven by mutual obligations, not the kind of obligations that equals have, because they don't believe in human or civic rights. They don't believe people are equal. Of course they're not. Some are rich, some are poor. Some are women, some are men. Some are smart, some are stupid. But it's a sense of obligations that connect the unequal as well as the equal. And a sense of virtue as something you do, not as a state you try and attain. Virtue is an active force in Roman ideas. It's not a condition. It's not like Christian grace. Now, these ideas roll out through the course of the Roman Empire. And we have a wonderful document here, a great bronze tablet found in near the French city of Lyon. And this tablet we call it the Tablet of Lyon, and it records a large chunk of a much longer speech by the Emperor Claudius, given to the Roman Senate in Rome in the year 48 CE. And in this speech, Claudius is trying to persuade the Senate to let the richest members of the people around Lyon, the Gauls, which is why they're celebrating it, to come into the Senate. People already citizens, already rich, already speak Latin, already live Roman lives, to allow them to enter. And in the course of this speech, which we have a shortened, cleaned-up version in a historian, but also we have part of this original, Claudius brings out some pretty straightforward arguments. He suggests that we should allow people to come in because they've always allowed people in. Because many of the Roman families who now dominate the Senate were once Etruscans or Greeks or others. Because many citizens were once enemies of Rome. And now they're at peace, and now they're united. So this is a notion of a city that's growing, or a community that's growing through marriage, through peace, through reconciliation. It's almost growing like a sort of, like a faith, isn't it? How many Roman generals, how many emperors have brought in new people? He, Claudius, will bring in some more. And he also mentions the enlightened self-interest bit, that if you bring rich provincials in, you can tax them. It's a final clench, isn't it? The Roman Empire, as it rolls out in the first few centuries of our era, is a world in which conquest is almost immediately followed by incorporation. Unlike the Empire of Alexander the Great, which scattered Macedonian and Greek colonies all the way to the Hindu Kush and Afghanistan, and then left them there for hundreds of years, producing a hereditary army which ruled over people who remained, Persians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and so on. The Romans, not by design, but by the good fortune of the institutions they'd been brought up with, drew people in. Romans had been bringing people into their community for much longer. They let their former slaves become citizens. They gave citizenship to their neighbours when they came to live in Rome. They gave citizenship to allies who fought on their side in wars. This rolled out, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, sometimes with some resistance. Towards the beginning of the last century BCE, virtually everybody in Italy becomes a Roman citizen, everyone south of the Po Valley. This is then spread out, and one of my colleagues in St Andrews has done some spectacularly amazing statistical calculations, which show that by about the year 200, about 35% of the population of the empire are already citizens, through one way or another, as ex-soldiers, as ex-slaves, as magistrates in cities. And then an emperor wakes up one day, and they do this occasionally. They wake up and think, I could be even more generous than my predecessors. Not, of course, because they're motivated by a strong sense of personal virtue, but by a strong sense of wanting to be celebrated as being more generous than their predecessors. When Nero freed all the Greeks from taxation, a concession that was immediately reversed by his successor. His speech, given at the Isthmus, says, other people have freed cities, only Nero a province. So it's competitive, it competes with the past. In this case, it's Emperor Caracalla, who enfranchises the rest. So virtually everybody in the Roman Empire, by the year 212, is a Roman citizen. So if you wanted to follow my friend Niall Ferguson in looking for the killer apps of the Roman Empire, I picked out a few. Ways to avoid having your society torn apart by diversity. Be open, an open elite. Allow social mobility, at least as a principle. Run your society based on values that aren't based on what ethnicity you're from and don't depend on religious authority. Establish a society that's hierarchical, not egalitarian, that rewards people who join and penalises, not necessarily punishes, but certainly doesn't help people who don't. Make being Roman something people want to do for their own interest and then persuade them afterwards that the gods wanted it anyway. Turn civilization into the property of all humanity, humanitas, for all the human race, not just civilization for the Greeks. When people look at what's happened in Europe since the 19th century, and particularly at cases like the conflicts of the middle of the 20th century, rise of Germany, the Second World War, and the collapse of communism, what's happening now in Eastern Europe, quite often they blame nationalism. They say, what caused this was a strange, weird and destructive idea spread through the peoples of the world. And this idea can be summed up in the phrase, Ruritania for the Ruritanians. All the Ruritanians should live in one country, and there should be one country for all the Ruritanians. One people, one kingdom. There's different ways of saying the slogan. The sociologist Ernst Gellner, whose work I greatly admire, has an argument in which he expresses this by trying to describe the difference between modern states and ancient ones. And he says, and you've got this nice illustration on the screen up here, that in all states before nationalism, you have a tiny little elite, priests, administrators, palace officials, the courtiers. And they sit and they have this sort of cosmopolitan culture. They all speak Greek, they all speak Aramaic, whatever. And underneath them, everybody lives in silos. Live in their own tiny little local worlds. And what happens with nationalism is this all changes so that the elite of France have more in common with the peasants of France than they do with the elite of Germany. And so Gellner would replace this box with another one. I'm not going to over-schematise by giving it to you, but basically he argues that these divisions break down here, these lateral these divisions dividing it, and instead you get nation states in which you invent something called British culture or American culture, which everybody shares irrespective of rank, wealth, and so on. And people have more in common with their fellow national citizens than with people of the same sort of class or status or education elsewhere. It's an interesting argument. We could talk about it longer. But I wanted, for the moment, to argue against it and to say, thinking about the Roman Empire helps us see nationalism in a different way. The Ruritania for the Ruritanian seems to me to be a solution, a bad solution, to problems of diversity that have been around already. There's the idea of creating a neutral space, the modern state, that's not based on ethnicity and not based on religion, not based on language, as a space in which people can be given rights and obligations and balanced out under a constitution. Now, this is a noble, but in the end, slightly unsuccessful attempt to deal with problems of diversity. If you look at the documents produced by the founders, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and those that followed, we'll find they were well aware of the difficulties of people who had different interests being united in the same body, of trying to balance interest groups, of dealing with one region against another, big states versus small states, Catholics versus Protestants, and so on. They're well aware of that, and this is the root of most national constitutions. Ukraine hasn't happened because of nationalism. It was the things that lead to Ukraine are happening anyway, and nationalism was an attempt to solve it. Throughout the 20th century, what we collectively did was try and get our nations right. We tried to jiggle with the boundaries. We tried to expel populations, move the Christians from Turkey into Greece, even if there might be ethnic Turks, and vice versa. Redraw the boundaries of Germany to include all the German speakers inside it. Divide up countries that seem at odds with themselves, like the Irish Catholics from the Irish Protestants, or the North Sudanese from the South Sudanese. If we can just jiggle with the boundaries, maybe the nation state will work. And my suggestion is the nation state doesn't work, at least not as a solution to that problem, although it was a good idea. The problem, in other words, is before that. And where's the problem come from? Well, I think the problem is already showing in those very rare exceptions that I pointed out to this idea that pre-industrial empires are largely untroubled by diversity. This is an image from the Arch of Titus in Rome, which shows the Roman triumph after the First Jewish War. Roman soldiers are processing through the city of Rome. They have placards, which will presumably carry the names of Jerusalem and other places they sacked. They carry booty at the menorah from the temple. They blow trumpets. They're praised by the crowds. And this, remember, is not an indictment of Roman rule. It's a celebration of it. This is how Romans wanted to think of themselves. Almost all the cases I mentioned of intercommunal violence or of struggles that spill out beyond this are cases in which religion and ritual has become a central aspect of how people are being identified. Our texts are often a bit unclear. Are they explaining the Egyptians or people who worship the Egyptian gods? Is there any difference? Are they driving out Jews or do they dispute with Judaism? Are they suppressing the Druids because they're rival leaders to Rome or because there's something about their gods? Already, though, by the end of the 1st century CE, Romans are beginning to wonder whether it would be more sensible to treat Jews as a religion, members of a religion, rather than as members of a people. And the reason is the overwhelming priority of all states, which is the tax bill. After the fall of the temple, the Romans impose a tax on being Jewish. They have a special treasury called the Fiscus Judaicus. You have to pay money in if you're a Jew. This is because Jews all over the diaspora send money to Jerusalem. And the idea is that as kind of reparations, Jews will now send it all into the Fiscus Judaicus. This money will be used to rebuild the temple of Jupiter in Rome, which actually the Jews didn't burn down, and Romans burned it down themselves during a civil war, but they didn't worry too much about those details. Now, of course, once you start taxing people, as apartheid regimes in South Africa found, or the Nazis in Germany, when they wanted to tax or penalise particular people, you have to define them. What is a Jew? And there's two answers to what is a Jew. One is a Jew is somebody descended from other Jews. And the other is a Jew is somebody who takes part and worships the Jewish God. One is about ethnicity, about descent, we might say race, and the other is about religion. And Romans decide that if you give up worshipping the God of the Jews, you don't have to pay the tax anymore. In other words, Romans are shuffling towards thinking about this, not as a people with their gods who happen to be rather dispersed, but as a religion that spreads. And when Christians come along, they do sometimes treat them as a people, an ethnicity, even though most Christians are converts. In fact, to begin with, most Christians are Jews. And this idea begins to develop of peoples defined by their religion rather than other things. I can tell you when this begins, and it begins in a very precise period of history when we begin to get large-scale persecution of religious minorities. Just a generation after everybody in the Roman Empire becomes a Roman citizen, the Emperor Decius tells all the Roman citizens in the world, now some 50 million of them, to perform religious sacrifices after a particularly disastrous defeat on the frontiers. And at this moment, they realise quite a lot of people are not willing to do this. And the people who are not willing to do this are Christians. And when they spot how many Christians there are, they begin to act against them. A generation later, we find the Persian Emperor Bahram II beginning to persecute the followers of Mani, a prophet, the founder of the religion of Manichaees, who's now disappeared. Mani claims to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. He's also interested in Buddhism and in Zoroastrianism. It's a great world religion that appeared and disappeared. And it begins to be persecuted in the Persian Empire. 5 years later, it begins to be persecuted in the Roman Empire, partly on grounds that they're all Persians. Things are not looking good if you're a Manichae. A few years later, Diocletian turns his activities against the Christians. the Great Persecution. And very shortly afterwards, when Constantine is the Roman emperor, not Diocletian, and Constantine is converted to Christianity, one of the first things he does is he issues an edict forbidding people to convert to the worship of the God of the Jews. Near the end of his reign, the Christians who live in the Persian Empire have started to demand that since there's a Christian emperor in the Roman Empire, he should help them against the Persians. He doesn't, but it initiates Persian persecution to Christians. This bullet list, you will appreciate, could go on for a very long time. But my point is this: we have moved suddenly into a world in which states have problems with minorities. We've moved into a world in which emperors look down on their population. They say they don't all believe the same thing. Maybe they're not all loyal. And this becomes the story of the Middle Ages. And it becomes the story of the Middle Ages not only in the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, but also in India, sponsorship, persecution of Buddhists, and eventually in China. And right along that band of empires I began by showing you, we find the same dynamics playing out. The condition of late antiquity is a world in which there are more and more exclusive religions. Manichees don't think you should be a Christian. Christians don't think you should be a Jew. Jews have separated themselves from Christians and so on. And across this world of imperial estates, emperors struggle to know what to do with it. Do you ally with the new faith? But if you ally with it, you end up with the Ukraine problem. You've got 80% of the population on your side and 20% hate you. Or do you tolerate everybody? But that doesn't work if they won't tolerate each other. Or do you persecute some of them? Persecution, weirdly, actually, is one of the ones that works. There are no Manichees today. Persecution is one of the very few solutions to this problem which is successful, but it's at a horrendous price, of course. And so you begin to get competition between religious authorities, priests, churches, secular authorities offering different views of the universe, different views of universal values, different ideas, different identities. Can a Christian serve in the Roman army? Asked the Christians with good conscience. Our kingdom is not of this world. Augustine talks about the Christians as being an alien nation, a civitas peregrina, or a pilgrim nation, spending a little bit of time on earth before going on to the kingdom that they really belong to, the kingdom of God. When you have a population that defines itself as alienated, the chance of bringing them on side is very difficult. What lessons can we learn from this? Well, I think one lesson I draw is that studying antiquity gives us a better idea about what's at issue. It shows, for example, that nationalism is not the issue, that nationalism is a solution to an issue that appears much earlier. It also shows how early that situation arose, that in a sense, we've all been Ukrainians for a very long time. We can't undo the changes in religious history that brought this about. But Roman history offers one paradigm, I think, this idea of humanitas, which is useful. An idea of having a set of values which is detached from the values of any particular faith. So not a Christian empire, but an empire that steps outside. Now, it wasn't in the imagination of ancient empires to separate church and state. It was an impossible idea before the Enlightenment. Only at that point could you begin to get a notion of secularism. But nevertheless, it did, almost accidentally, manage religious difference. Roman values aren't ours, and I wouldn't for the moment want to become a bloodthirsty spectator at gladiatorial games, or to own slaves, or worse, to be somebody else's slave. And the Roman world is not one you can hold up for universal admiration. There are one or two positions in Roman society it wouldn't be bad occupying, but statistically, not many people in this room would get there. The Roman world was a pretty brutal place, and if it didn't have so much actual violence, the structural violence and the structural inequality was enormous. But one particular bit of their package, this idea of setting a universal set of values that sits outside all these other ones, this is maybe something that gives us the best chance for the future. Thank you for your attention.
you have any questions, please make sure you get the microphone first. There are microphones on both sides.
Everyone's convinced.
Well, thank you for a fascinating presentation. There's a lot of relevance for us today, obviously. I'm intrigued by something that you had on on this slide, actually. If you could elaborate a bit more about exclusive religions, Christianity being one. You can't be Christian and Jew. Buddhism, I don't think, is an exclusive religion. Hinduism certainly is not. Paganism was not. Islam is, and thereby hangs a tale. Can you just elaborate this idea of what accounts in a way for the rise of exclusiveness in religion when for so many millennia exclusiveness had no value, wasn't recognized as something that was necessary or good?
I do think you put your finger on exactly the new feature that emerges in this period. We don't know exactly where it starts from. Jews, I suppose, but maybe Jews got the idea from Zoroastrians. I mean, one answer would be to say, in a world in which there's competition of a kind, demanding exclusive membership gives you an edge. It's a kind of evolutionary advantage in a world in which lots of religions bump into each other. Another would be that in a world of universal empires, making universal claims seems to be something that is easier to happen. So religious thinkers mirror the claims made by emperors in the same way that later emperors mirror the claims made by religious leaders. But it certainly is something new. And although it's probably not, I agree with you, it's not true of Buddhism today. There's certainly, if you're thinking about the Indian Emperor Ashoka, his notion of Buddhism is a sort of top religion, a kind of one that incorporates all the others. And there's huge persecution to Buddhists, Buddhist monasteries persecuted by first Indian kings and then later by Chinese emperors. So, and in very recent time, the last couple of centuries, Neo-Hinduism also has begun to develop its own special brands of fundamentalism, and so this strange idea has spread. But what the actual origin point, in a way, I think it's less important to know who thought of it first, because maybe people thought about it in the Paleolithic too, but it just never got beyond the next valley. But once you've got this great interconnected world where from the China Sea to the Atlantic, you have people moving backwards and forwards between these sibling civilizations, and they really do have a global reach and a global vision. At that point, the idea that you might have a single global view of the cosmos, maybe that becomes more feasible.
We have a question from California, from Ted DePadova. Was the contrast between Roman political and cultural ideals around the time of the late Republic as marked as or more marked than the contrast in present-day America or Great Britain?
Sorry, could you repeat the first part, the first sentence?
Was the contrast between Roman political and cultural ideals around the time of the late Republic as marked as or more marked than the contrast in present-day America or Great Britain?
I think present-day America and Great Britain are quite different animals, and I expect there are differences within each of them. Britain is very largely a secular state, one that goes through the motions of being a Christian state, but to all intents and purposes operates as a secular state within which different groups are treated with consideration, but not given priority. You in this room are better placed to say whether that's true of the United States of America. My impression is things are organised a bit differently here. One big difference, Ted, I think, between what's happening today and back in the late Republic is we're able to verbalize these things and think about them in much clearer terms, that for people of Cicero and Varro's generation, it would have been quite difficult for them to imagine something like the secular or civil society without also imagining civil society including a society of gods. So there are people who even think, well, the Roman gods are treated as effectively big citizens, big long-lived citizens, part of the community of the Romans, who have to be given some consideration, but only to a larger extent than you give rich people consideration. So I think after the Enlightenment, we do think about things differently. But I'm not sure there's a world consensus, even in the sort of Anglo-Saxon West, on how we're reorganizing things right now.
Thank you. In the developing world today, you have an exodus from the rural areas to the city, and there's a lot of geographic mobility. I was just wondering, when you're talking about Rome having to resupply its population, how much was the geographic mobility and people leaving the rural areas to go to the cities?
It looks like there was quite a lot. It looks like people moved from small towns to larger towns and from large towns to big cities. And they do, and there's certainly areas that are net exporters of population, healthy upland areas like the Abruzzi in Italy, and areas that are mortality traps. The city of Rome itself probably has hyperendemic malaria. Leprosy is on the rise in the Nile Valley. So there's areas which have death rates exceeding the birth rate, and areas where the birth rate exceeds the death rate, and there's movement between the two. The differences, I suppose, are the ancient world seems to be more or less a steady state system. Very possibly population is growing at a rate of 0.5% a year, which is very, very low. And of course, what's happening in the developing world today is we're getting not only rural-urban migration, but we're also getting demographic growth, or in some parts of Africa where AIDS, HIV is prevalent, also devastating selective generational loss as well. So I think the background's different, that they weren't undergoing the demographic transition that we are as a planet. There wasn't vast population increase in the Roman world. But yeah, the other effects that you describe are exactly the same. And so cities are full of people who grew up in the country, which makes you think about cities differently. These are not urbanites. They're people who are missing the fresh vegetables. There's been some really interesting work done recently using stable isotope analysis, which you can use to, if you look at different bits of the human body, you can get an idea of the differences in the food supplies and water they drank at different ages in their life. And so you can tell, looking at skeletal remains, whether people were brought up in the areas they died in or were buried in properly. And the answer is often not. It appears that people did move around quite a lot. It's one of those sciences that's just a few decades old. But I reckon that within 20 years, we'll be able to say with some degree of precision quite how much rural-urban migration there is. And my guess is it'll be a lot.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. The concept of humanitas seems to involve an interplay between culture and values. And if one therefore is talking about universal human values, does that involve talk about a universal human culture, which suggests a homogeneity of culture? And one, I suppose, could argue that we are approaching that more than we ever have before, and therefore that the possibility of a new humanitas becomes, a reality in that setting, that is a homogeneity of culture, though I'm not sure that's desirable.
I think I agree very much that what the Romans have done, which is different from most other groups, is they have connected value and culture very centrally. That you can define Greek culture largely in cultural terms, language, education, this on, without necessarily connecting it in the way that the Romans did at the heart of Humanitas. I think we are developing a global culture, and I think it's a good thing, because I think the alternative is much worse. that it's quite. I completely understand, and part of me feels the sort of liberal sentiment towards saying, well, let there be thousands and thousands of cultures across the planet. But if each one of them, if you don't have at least some elements of a kind of common root of values, they don't rub along too well. Because we all know that if you put a liberal culture in the same room as an illiberal culture, one of them eats the other, and it's not the liberals. That one of the difficulties that we have is that we attempt. If there are ground rules that say, we will all respect each other's, a particular bit of each other's cultures and leave them alone, then you could imagine you could have a kind of master culture, like an operating system, right? Which would be the rules of engagement, the sort of, these would be, well, they need to be rules of engagement, it's too negative, isn't it? But they're sort of situational ethics. You can say, well, within this, you can have the little pockets, say, right, everybody comes to supper at the same time, but not everyone has to eat pasta, right? But in practice, it's really difficult to separate out that operating system from the content. And so unless we come to some time where quite fortuitously all the different cultures in the world, through their separate trajectories, end up with something we can live with along the lines of liberalism or the United Nations Charter of Human Rights or whatever, we're not going to get there. I mean, we haven't solved the problem of how you live in a city in which some people believe in Sharia law and other people believe in a civil society.
Another question on the internet from Caitlin from UNE. One of the main strengths that the Roman Empire had is its ability to become such a powerful empire. In its ability to become such a powerful empire is this idea of everyone having their place and role in society. However, today everyone wants the best of everything and to be the top dog. How are we able to thrive as a society in today's world with people not being as accepting as they once were during the Roman Empire of their social status or hierarchy, their place in the hierarchy, whatever it is?
Well, thanks, Caitlin. I mean, my guess is that people in the Roman Empire, quite a few of them wanted to be top dog as well. And not all of them could do it. So they probably had some of the same sort of difficulties we have. What did Camus say? Life's like a game of football, and the rules are arbitrary, but you can play it well or badly. And we could all accept the right to compete for being top dog if we all accepted to be good losers if we didn't make it. So I can certainly imagine ways of constructing ethical systems, whether it's competition and personal ambition, or reconciled with coexistence. It doesn't seem to me. I mean, I'm beginning to sound like sort of what Duke of Wellington, the Battle of Waterloo won on the playing fields of Eton. I'm not an old Etonian, but I don't think it's I don't think ambition is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think Thucydides put it rather nicely in Pericles' funeral oration, where he's talking about ambition, and he said it's not wrong to want to compete, to want to do well. What's wrong is not to want to compete. So I think so long as we all accept those kind of rules. I mean, what spoils the game is bad losers, not winners. There's always winners.
On this note, I think thank you so much for a great talk. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for being a great audience.